2023 meeting of the School Performance and Accountability Committee of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. Hayden, will you please take a roll call of the commissioners to reconvene after our recess?
Commissioner Richards.
Here.
Commissioner Tudor. Here. Commissioner Grissom.
Here.
Chairman, you have the floor.
Thank you. The School Performance and Accountability Committee will hear several presentations from staff today. First, Maggie Lund, Deputy Director of Authorizing, will provide an update on the renewal process. Next, we will hear a wrap-up of the 22-23 school year and a preview of the 2023-2024 school year from the Director of Authorizing, Beth Figueroa, and Director of Finance and Operations, Melanie Harrell. We will conclude with a presentation on the charter school data landscape from Maggie Lund. Do commissioners have any questions or comments on the agenda before we vote to approve?
I make a motion to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it and the agenda is approved. Our next matter of business is the minutes from the March 23, 2023 meeting. These minutes have been provided. Does anyone have any edits or comments to make regarding the prior minutes before we proceed?
Make a motion to approve.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
No opposed? All right. Our next item is a presentation that will provide the committee an update on the charter renewal process from Deputy Director of Authorizing, Maggie Lund. Maggie, you are recognized.
Thank you, Commissioner Richards. As you stated, I will be providing you all an update on the renewal process underway for Promise Academy, Spring Hill, and for Lester Prep. So as a reminder, here are the components of the renewal process. So first, we compile and send a cumulative performance report to the applicant in January of year 9 of their charter term. This report outlined all historical performance data that we were able to pull from publicly available data. And we also aligned this performance report to the commission-approved renewal criteria for the applicant and determined on-track and off-track statuses. The applicant then submitted an application for renewal in April of year 9. In May and June, the commission convened a review committee of both internal and external experts to review and score the application, identifying strengths and weaknesses. As a note, capacity interviews are optional in this process, though commission staff did conduct a capacity interview for both applicants. And then as a result of the review committee process, commission staff will generate a review committee report. In September of year 10, the review committee will conduct a renewal site visit and will generate a site visit report for that. And in October or November of year 10, the commission will hold a public hearing in the local school district for the applicant. And before this hearing, a preliminary recommendation will be provided to the applicant, and the applicant will be able to speak to this recommendation during the public hearing. Finally, in January of year 10, the commission will issue an executive director's recommendation ahead of the commission meeting, and that is when the commission will make its final decision on the renewals for the applicant. So as I mentioned before, the following schools are going through the renewal process currently. We have Lester Prep, which is a school that transitioned from the ASD to the commission in 2022. We've authorized them for about a year, and the school is located in Memphis. Promise Academy Spring Hill just completed their pre-opening process this month to join the commission. We actually just had their closeout meeting earlier today. And they transitioned from the ASD to the commission as well, and they are also located in Memphis. In January of 2023, the commission approved specific renewal criteria for these schools given their unique position of being turnaround schools. These schools both earned priority exit status, which allowed them to apply to the commission from the ASD. However, the commission has not been their authorizer for very long, so we were reliant on primarily publicly available data when it came to their cumulative performance. So this renewal criteria was really contextualized for this unique situation. As a reminder, in Tennessee, conditional renewals are not permitted, so that means that if the school is renewed, it would be for a 10-year charter agreement. So up until this point, in the process, commission staff have done the following with the renewal process. We've created and sent cumulative performance reports for each school in alignment with the commission-approved renewal criteria, and this report designated schools for each criteria as on track and off track. The schools then both submitted their renewal applications to the commission by the April deadline, and within these applications, the schools did address any off-track criteria from the cumulative performance report. We then convened a review committee in May of this year. The review committee reviewed the applications and scored them against the renewal review committee rubric. And the members of the review committee are myself, Trent Carlson, who's our authorizing coordinator, and Michelle Doan, who's an external consultant. The review committee completed their reviews of the renewal applications on June 30th, 2023, and we chose to hold capacity interviews with both applicants. Most of the questions in those capacity interviews surrounded finance, operations, and facilities, which are all topics that are typically discussed outside of a typical site visit. So during the site visit, the review committee will address academic questions that surfaced as a result of the review of the applications. As a note, these capacity interviews took place on June 27th and 29th. One item to note here that I just want to call out explicitly that is unique to the schools that are up for renewal currently as ASD transition schools is that in alignment with Tennessee Code Annotated 49-1-614K2, is that schools must either purchase the facility from Memphis Shelby County that they're currently in, or lease that facility, or the third option is to find another facility, and they have 3 years to do so upon renewal. So given that they are going through the renewal process currently, that was a point of discussion as well in the capacity interview around what their facility plans were and what contingency plans existed to ensure that they fulfill their statutory requirement. Review committee reports are currently being finalized as a result of the review committee process. We'll share these reports with operators ahead of the site visits in September. As I mentioned, these reports not only outline strengths and concerns from the application review and the capacity review, but they'll also outline topics that will be discussed at the site visit in September. The site visits have been scheduled for both schools. So on September 19th, we will be going to Promise Academy Spring Hill for a full day. And on September 20th, we will be at Lester Prep. So during these site visits, the review committee will observe classes, we interview staff, students, families, and we meet with the school network leadership team to discuss and outline the concerns that the review committee and the questions that the review committee had within the review committee report. We will also generate a site visit report as part of that process, and both the review committee report and the site visit report are exhibits to the executive director's recommendation. So commissioners will receive the executive director's report and recommendation prior to the January meeting, and this report includes, as I mentioned, the 2 exhibits. It'll also include findings from the public hearing that we'll be holding in the resident district in October or November of that year. And at this January 2024 meeting, commissioners will make the renewal decision for Promise Academy Spring Hill and Lester Prep. Again, renewal decisions are for 10-year charter terms, and if the school is not renewed, it will close at the end of school year 2023-24. So this time, I'll take any questions you may have.
Do any commissioners have questions?
Madam Chairman, I ask a question. So knowing that we've got some other ASD schools that we're going to be looking at later this year, I was not aware of the provision here by state law on buildings. So depending on that outcome in October, it probably, if we don't do so, is worth making sure these schools are aware, because what I read here is that if you transition out, then that's when this applies. It isn't at the end of a 10-year period that you have to do. Is that correct? And if so, it probably is worth making sure so there's not what I call stalker chick, a shock when you all of a sudden get to see this saying, well, that's part of what happens if you do transition out.
Yes, thank you for that question. That is a question on the new start application. And as we move into any appeals that we get, we will bring this up as if you transition to the commission, FYI, this is not something that they have to worry about immediately.
Right.
but upon renewal, that's when the conversation really has to begin. And I think we've been lucky to have a couple of ASD schools currently under our jurisdiction, or formerly ASD schools, who have started this process. So we're really learning from them. How much lead time do you need to begin this process, such that we can then support and coach schools that are now going through this process so that they're prepared for, this is not something that you can do in year 2.5.
Right.
This is a multi-year process, and so they need to start thinking about that now.
Any other questions? Yes.
So just to be clear, the trigger for all three of the options, either purchase, lease, or find a new facility, the trigger for that is renewal. So they have that 3-year deadline to do any of those three. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Maggie, for this update. And we will go ahead and move into our wrap-up for the 2022-2023 school year from Director of Authorizing Beth Figueroa and Director of Finance and Operations Melanie Harrell. You're both recognized.
Thank you, Chair Richards. Today, Melanie and I will be presenting a wrap-up of the 22-23 school year. There's a lot of items that we're going to cover, but at the end of the day, it will be great to kind of summarize where we landed as far as our special populations data is concerned. Third grade proficiency rates, we're going to be looking at school-specific items such as closing out pre-opening, and then Melanie will have some updates with schools. So to begin this discussion, we wanted to kind of ground it in an overview of what our portfolio looked like. So for the 22-23 school year, the commission had 9 schools that were open and operating. So in the prior year, we had 4, we grew to 9. 5 of the schools are here in Memphis and 4 are in Nashville for a total enrollment of approximately 3,600 students. So the growth that occurred within our portfolio was really due to the transition of 3 ASD schools, and then we had 2 new start schools. An important flag to mention is if you look at the enrollment column here, is that something that we are noting as just a part of the new start process specifically is that charter schools that are new typically do have some enrollment struggles in their first few years, and so that's something that we are helping support those schools. And as we even talk about new start appeals tomorrow, that's definitely some work that we will be leaning into going forward. So I'm next going to transition into looking at our special populations overview. We talked about this, we really had a lot of continuous conversation actually at looking at our subgroup enrollment data and our trends, and really looking at where do our schools fall in comparison with not only local subgroup percentages, but also looking at how do our schools compare with the districts in which they're located in. And so this is really a critical item for us as we monitor schools as an authorizer, because this not only lives in our framework, but statute clearly states that our charter schools are required to provide educational services for students with disabilities, English language learners, and students with diverse needs. And so this is considered high importance to our authorizing work. It's a high importance when we look at new start applications. It is really a pivotal part of what we do as authorizers. And so as we dive into our actual percentages on these slides, I am going to just caveat that the data and percentages that were included here in the slide deck, they did come from various sources. We have our student information system, EIS, that we pulled information from. We also pulled items from TDOE data downloads. And so just they are, just for context, this is really for us to help contextualize where our schools sit, but they may vary ever so slightly from district information or maybe some TDOE documents based on downloads. So again, this is just a snapshot. So as we look at the state and how Metro Public Schools and Memphis Shelby County schools differ, the key takeaways here are that MMPS serves a greater population of students with limited English proficiency and economically disadvantaged within the state. And then their students with disabilities remain fairly consistent with the state. Similarly, Memphis Shelby County Schools have a higher rate of EL students and EL students and those qualifying as economically disadvantaged, while students with disabilities, their rate is lower than those of the state and MMPS. Next, diving in more deep as far as our district comparisons. And so we wanted to look more closely at each of our districts and how not only do our schools compare with the districts as a whole, but what if we were to look at MMPS and specifically the charter schools that are operating within that district. And so here, most interesting data points I would say is that charter schools as a whole generally trend within 1 to 2 percentage points of the district when it comes to students with limited English proficiency, students with disabilities, and economically disadvantaged. However, when we look at the range across schools, these do vary greatly, and we would say that this is likely due to where the charter is located, the students that they serve. Moving to Memphis Shelby County Schools, we do find a lot more variance here between charter schools and district percentages. And so percentages of charter school students with limited English proficiency and economically disadvantaged are consistent with the district. The students with disabilities rate is much lower. And similar to Nashville, we see quite a range depending on the school. So now we're going to take this a little bit deeper and say, how do the demographics compare when we look at commission schools with the districts and the district's charter schools specifically? And so when you look at, when looking at the percentage of English learners, we see that there's much more variance in Memphis than there is in Nashville. And that's mostly due to the neighborhoods in which they're located. So in Memphis specifically, you can see that Bluff City High School and Cornerstone Prep School have much higher EL percentages than Cornerstone Prep Denver, Lester Prep, and Libertas. While for Nashville, those are generally fairly consistent, with the only outlier being Kent Antioch Middle, and that's mostly just due to how the system holds EL only and the date that that information was. Next, looking at students with disabilities, these rates vary by school. The overall trends that I would highlight here is that in Memphis, we find that commission schools are serving a much higher percentage of students with disabilities in Memphis Shelby County schools. And then for Nashville, I would highlight that we've had a lot of continuous conversations surrounding specifically our new schools. We have typically found that our new schools start out with lower rates of students with disabilities, but just as a flag here, we see that Nashville Collegiate Prep and Rocket Ship Community or Dream Community Prep now are serving rates consistent with KIPP. And so definite continuous improvements for them. But I also will say that this is something that we monitor on a quarterly basis. We're always in continuous discussion with schools
That's a
to
big
ensure that
improvement.
they're serving.
But I think part of it is just pushing on like we've done.
Next is looking at economically disadvantaged, similar to what we've seen when looking at each district range across schools. The rates vary, and that's really just based on the location, specifically when we look at Memphis. And then for Nashville, the rates are all fairly consistent, and that's because the schools are really concentrated in the Antioch region of Nashville. Okay, I'm now going to shift gears to our district third grade ELA proficiency rates. And so we know that third grade retention is at the top of everybody's minds. And so we wanted to provide this chart here for you as it depicts how our students perform when we compare them with Metro Nashville Public Schools, the Shelby County Schools, and the Achievement School District. And so what we found when we looked at this proficiency snapshot is that commission schools' overall performance was fairly consistent with Metro Nashville Public Schools. However, we did outperform and demonstrate higher levels of proficiency than Memphis Shelby County Schools and ASD. One thing to note here is that there are multiple pathways for when it comes to third grade retention, and so we will be providing an update at a subsequent meeting once we really know what the actual retention rate is. And then now just transitioning to our authorizing touch points. And so for here, just wanting to ground us as we start diving into reopening, wrapping up kind of on a more school-by-school basis, just all of the different touch points that we have with our schools on a regular basis. And so throughout the school, we're regularly both meeting with our school operators, both in person as well as just through our regular monitoring activities. And over the last 2 weeks, we actually have been meeting in person with our school operators for stakeholder meetings, and that's been a really great opportunity for us to meet and just discuss with them what autonomy and scaling looks like, and just have those regular touch points. So when we meet with them at your meetings, they're not surprised whether they're off track or if there's areas that they need to improve. Then pre-opening. So our pre-opening process, this is really a pivotal part of our work throughout the year. We had 4 schools that we helped get through the pre-opening process. And so this begins as soon as they're approved. So we have the 2 new commission schools that went through the pre-opening process, Tennessee Nature Academy and Kips High School, and then the ASD transition schools. And so we have monthly meetings with them where we cover everything from enrollment, facility, staffing, all of those items. And it's really important that we make sure that they are set up for success, that they understand what it takes to open a school, and it concludes with the facility walkthrough.
Can I interrupt just for a second? As you went through this process, did you talk with them about their actions they are taking to make sure that students arrive the first day of school and attend early in the school year? Because I know in Memphis, Shelby County, it's been historically a trend that a significant number of students don't arrive until the 3rd or 4th week of school, and that gets everybody behind. So did you talk with them about that?
As a part of the pre-opening process?
Yes, ma'am.
That's a great question. I will start, and then I'm gonna kick it over to Maggie if they want to add. So one of the things that we have been talking with the school operators with is when they've given us their enrollment numbers, we've definitely had conversations about being realistic about whether or not the students that have expressed interest will actually show up and giving themselves some wiggle space. But I will let you guys speak if you have further conversation.
One thing to add there, I think Beth did a great job kind of summarizing those conversations. One thing that we do talk really deeply about is engagement that happens prior to the school year and school at day 1 readiness. And so with both operators that are like our brand new operators, they've held back to school nights and things like that prior to day 1 to make sure that they're making those important touch points, while also making sure they're adjusting their percentages as needed and being realistic as to who will actually show up on day 1.
Thank you. My big concern with this is that, there is a whole tradition in Memphis of not showing up until the first week of September. And they may be enrolled and they might show up in enrollment numbers after that, but, I'm glad to hear you were talking about this because it's really hard to get these kids in school in August.
And that is a really helpful flag for us too, because a lot of the schools that we have authorized through the New Start process have been in Nashville. And so the only school in Memphis that has gone through this pre-opening process with this district was Palm City, Spring Hill, and they're a pre-existing school. So that's very helpful information. So our new schools that we will be opening next year include Tennessee Nature Academy. They're going to be opening in Nashville. They are, as I mentioned earlier about enrollment and it typically coming in under what they are projecting. And so Tennessee Nature Academy is in that boat. They have recruited approximately 110 students, but they did have a goal of 160. So we continue to work with them and monitor that. They are going through the due diligence process for a long-term facility. They got some land donated, which is a really great opportunity for them. And they're going to open in a temporary facility. And then we have Kip Antioch Global High School. They're going to be opening in Nashville, serving grades 9. And they have recently completed their whole filler or feeder pattern that will all go into high school. So lots of really great things happening for them. They'll open in year 1, serving grade 9. Next, we have those ASD transition schools we talked about. These were the schools that were approved at the January commission meetings. We have Lee Neely's Bend opening in Nashville. Their enrollment's around 355 students. And then Promise Academy Spring Hills, as Maggie mentioned, we just did the walkthrough there this morning. And they serve approximately 370 students there. And then the last thing I'll just update you on is National Student Prep. They also went through kind of a truncated pre-opening process because they have a lot of pre-opening construction projects going on. And so they were very fortunate. They were able to secure a facility that is right across the street from their current facility. And we talked a lot about just the constraints that they've had with as far as how many students they can fit in that building. So the great thing about this new facility is that it will accommodate them both in the short term as well as the long term. This was a really great opportunity for them. The school also had a groundbreaking ceremony last month, and that facility will eventually serve grades 5 through 8. Construction is underway. They're on track to open that new facility in the fall, so there's a lot of excitement in that community surrounding the new school. And then we will continue to work with them through pre-opening as well as into next year, because there's still a lot of monitoring of the construction that will have to take place. And then I will pass over to Melanie to talk about school safety.
Thanks so much, Beth. And I know we've already had a conversation about this, and this will continue to be an ongoing area of focus for our team, and I know for you all. But I want to give sort of an update on where we are, what happened over the course of last year, and then a brief preview of what we're seeing coming down the pipeline for next year. So first, and we'll be talking a little bit more about this when we talk about our prep for next year. But we are being very intentional about trying to build out supports that will be managed by our school programs and supports team, with the goal of not being able to just sort of look at our schools from a compliance standpoint, but also be able to be a conduit for technical assistance and additional supports like that. So I want to talk a little bit about the monitoring that happened this year, and then some of the grants and funding that are currently available to our schools, and some things that we're planning to implement for next year. So this year, our schools had a school security audit. There is sort of a yearly process, and then there is an annual audit process, every 5 years, there's an additional audit process. So the Department of Education actually monitored many of our schools directly and did a more extensive security audit. One thing that I think is important to know is that when we talk about school safety and we talk about security plans and audits, it's not just preparing for violent incidents or trying to avoid violent incidents. These plans cover everything from carpool flow, transportation requirements, maintaining safe spaces, and hazardous materials. I mean, so this is a much more in-depth conversation and set of tools than just sort of trying to prepare for or avoid very unfortunate violent situations. So something that we saw from school security assessments and a change for this year was that previously schools would get sort of a risk level designation overall. And the tool has actually changed to that the TDOE has identified essentially prioritized indicators. And what we saw overwhelmingly across the board is that the vast majority of these prioritized indicators, all or almost all of our schools were sort of fully in compliance with them. So that was very encouraging, not to say that there are not one-offs or areas that schools can improve. But again, a lot of those might be a speed bump is not where it's supposed to be. So not all indicators are necessarily created equal or of the most pressing importance, but we do really want to focus as the department and Homeland Security, we'll be focusing on these more prioritized indicators. So moving forward, something that we've talked about as we continue to think about how we build this out and how we build out additional supports at the district level for this is making sure that we're incorporating some school safety checks, school security checks into site visits, which will give us sort of an additional touch point other than just the security assessment that's completed by each school with a law enforcement officer at the beginning of the year and sort of filters up to the TDOE, making sure that we can also have very intentional conversations with our schools about what they're seeing in their school building, what needs they have, being able to get a better sense of this is a meaningful issue as opposed to you had a 5.5-inch plate on your door instead of a 6-inch plate on your door. So making sure that we are able to continually get a better sense of what's going on in our school from a safety and security lens. This year was the last year of what was called previously Safe Schools funding. This was transparently not a very large amount of funding that we managed a grant for each of our schools through. These funds always had to be aligned with the findings of the security assessment, but I will say, given the wide range of standards. It was very much up to each school how they spent those funds, and it was pretty easy to find something to align to. So this year, what was previously Safe Schools funding has been incorporated into TISA. That grant as a kind of recurring dollar amount no longer exists as a standalone. But what has been created over the last legislative session is an SRO grant and then what's called a public school security grant. So first, the SRO grant is actually not provided to schools or districts. It is provided to law enforcement agencies with the goal of them being able to expand their capacity to hire additional SROs. I think we're hearing some challenges about how people work with their law enforcement agencies and make sure that charters feel like they have equitable access. We know there is a statewide shortage of school resource officers. And so I think we, even though we are not eligible to directly receive these funds, this requires our schools to work with their local law enforcement to participate in that program. We are engaging with other stakeholders around how do we not only help our schools gain access to these resources, but also across the sector and statewide. So we're continuing ongoing discussions with that, and we'll think about that moving forward. The public school security grant is pretty similar to the Safe Schools grant with one big change, which is that it is going to be provided directly to charter schools based on their school year 22-23 ADMs. So each of our schools that were open and operating this last school year received an allocation directly from the TDOE that is managed by them. That grant is being a little bit more explicitly tied to those prioritized standards and their individualized security assessments. But our schools have all received those allocations and are all working on their grant applications currently with the Department of Education. As part of that, all charter schools across the state are having to provide their drill logs, their emergency operations plans, things that we have always collected as part of our monitoring procedures and our compliance standards, but may not have been as consistently implemented across the state. So we're excited that we feel like our schools are well positioned to be able to kind of roll what had been their Safe Schools procedures into that, while additionally being able to participate in some additional guidance and oversight from the department. So, yes, Eddie. Commissioner Smith, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. Just a quick question for you. So thinking about, because you said some of the charter schools are having problems with the SRO grant that's provided to local law enforcement. Going back to something that, Commissioner Levine said a minute ago, which is, it might be difficult for us to impact safety in the community. One of the ways that has it ever been discussed about sharing attendance information with those SROs so that they can look at those students that may be constantly truant, that may be causing problems in the community, that could also bring problems into the school as a way to start preventing issues in the school as well?
We have not had explicit conversations about that. The truancy process tends to work a little bit differently and with different entities than as the typically would employ SROs. So truancy referrals actually happen through the court system, and depending on which, county sheriff's office or police department you're working with, enforcement of that may look a little bit different. Now, certainly, I think both, some of our schools that have SROs and other SROs across the state, they may help support some truancy efforts in increasing engagement, helping communication, things like that. But that's really going to depend sort of on the situation and jurisdiction that the school is in. But I do think that's an interesting idea for us to investigate and think through how are other people, what are other states, schools, districts doing around this, and how would that potentially be a lever?
I think, Eddie, you're onto it. I mean, this is a much bigger problem than just in the charters. Obviously, I'm told, certainly here in Memphis, the numbers of kids that they don't even know in the overall traditional public school system, the number of kids they don't even know where they are. And so I guess the real question for me is, beyond the resources and tools that are available in the traditional public schools, what flexibilities do the charter schools have that maybe the public schools that are traditional don't have And are there resources that can be allocated there? At least I would love to see a scenario where our schools' truancy and absenteeism rates are much lower than the traditional public schools, and be able to point to a reason why.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that as we look at absenteeism data and we have conversations with our schools, because I do think we have many schools that have a much lower truancy and chronic absenteeism rate than their resident district or their neighboring schools. And so I think that's a great thing for us to think about as we have maybe site visits and we continue conversations with our schools. For our schools, I'm thinking even at some of our stakeholder meetings, for our schools that we're seeing are really having success in decreasing their truancy or chronic absenteeism rates, is there any best practices that can be shared across our district? Is there sort of any lessons learned in ways that we can continue to facilitate that conversation and support for our schools? So I think that's a great idea. Something to think about.
Yeah, I would like to understand at our next meeting, how many of our schools actually have SRO support in Memphis and also in Davidson County? Because I know the situation with the Memphis police force is dire, just to have officers for community resources. And I'd just like to see where we are and then also compare it to where the general charter population is for Memphis Shelby County, and then also support for the non-charter public schools. Because I'm afraid we're going to be at the end of the line for resources and we need to not be there.
Yeah, I do also think an important clarification, and Biden brought this up for that, is that sort of definitionally in the state, an SRO has to be a full-time law enforcement officer employed by the relevant local enforcement agency. What many schools have is they may not have an SRO, but they may have a school security officer that is not necessarily tied to that particular jurisdictional law enforcement agency. The SRO grant is currently limited only to funding true SROs and not additional school security officers, but I do think so. I think there's a slight distinction there in that many more schools may have security officers that are sort of third-party contractors or employees, but not as many have SROs.
And so Hayden, this is more for you because I know you're aware of this. With whatever happens to special session, we may not be able to get this issue resolved there. It probably is more likely in the next regular session. And so I know you're going to be tracking this and trying to work with both the administration and with our supporters of the legislature to try to fix this shortage of actual officers who can go in and use security people that come in. So I want everybody to know we may not get it fixed in the special session, if there is one, probably won't get it fixed, but that doesn't mean we can't come back next year and try then to, where you've got a regular session to try to go in and address this shortage.
And Melanie, to your point, and I want to make sure that we're, to what Tom just said, as we look at the General Assembly session next year, school resource officers, the true SROs, are law enforcement. They can support a school. Security for a school starts at the home. It doesn't start at the school door. So that's why I bring up this collaboration between the school and those SROs in the community, knowing how can we make the community around the school safer, which will make the school safer. Those school officers are actually in the building. So that's why I wanted to bring up looking at that collaborative partnership, because I think if we could figure that out, that would move us from the back of the line to the front of the line, because those law enforcement agencies are going to see an ROI for their community.
One additional thing that I want to mention that we're looking at implementing next year is that we have some savings under ESSER 3. As I mentioned, this public school security grant was only allocated based on prior year AEMs. So our new schools, unfortunately, and our expanding schools were not eligible for additional funds or funds under that program. And so something that we've decided for this upcoming year is that we're going to reallocate some of those ESSER 3 savings that we have specifically to our schools for school security initiatives. So that will make sure that we are capturing and have a little bit more equitable access for our new and expanding schools, but also that we continue to show our schools that we're prioritizing this and that we are providing them additional funding for this, in addition to what the Department and Homeland Security are providing. Okay, if there's no more questions about school safety, I'll move over to another hot topic, which is summer camps. This year, all of our schools were required to offer a summer camp option for all of their K-8 students. This is required to be offered for priority identified students. Realistically, I think pretty universally, our schools offer this to all students, while they may kind of additionally incentivize priority students. So just a little bit of an overview of the landscape. 7 of our schools offered camps at either the individual school or at a network school. So somewhere sort of within their charter network. 2 of our commission schools entered into an MOU with the resident district for their students to be able to attend the Geographic LEA's camp. So we know this year that there were particularly important implications for the summer camp process. Not that it's not important for all grades, but for 3rd grade students, because 3rd grade students that were identified for potential retention, one of the pathways was to attend summer camp, maintain a 90% attendance rate, and show that they made adequate growth based on the pre and post test outcomes for those students. So we did see many of our schools had a great amount of movement, students that were at danger of being retained and were able to not be retained based on their attendance to summer camp. But that is something that we worked with our schools very heavily on to make sure that they understood those requirements and that they were engaging with both their parents and their students around, and their staff members around the implications for 3rd grade retention and the supports that were going to be needed for those students in particular.
All right, are there any questions that haven't already been raised on the 2022-2023 school wrap-up? Okay, thank you both. We appreciate your help and assistance, and we're going to be looking forward to seeing where we go. And now, if you would roll into the 2023-2024 school year preview.
Thank you. So now that we've wrapped up prior year, it's time for us to look forward to the year ahead. And so, I don't need to, we've already talked a lot about our portfolio and how it's been growing, but the focus really of today, this specific presentation is not just on the fact that we will have more schools, we'll have more enrollment, but it's also about how we are adjusting as staff so that way we can scale all of the important monitoring and authorizing and behavior to really accommodate and streamline all of our processes, all the while also ensuring that our processes are tight and that we're still ensuring high quality schools. So as we look at just the overview of our portfolio, I think the big key takeaways here are that we are going from 9 schools in 22-23 to 13 schools, still localized to Nashville and Shelby County. And so we'll have that total of 13 schools with a projected enrollment of 4,700. So again, just continued steady growth with the addition of schools. And then we also can't forget that we have 3 other schools that we've authorized that will be opening in 24-25. And that's the 2 KIPP schools that were approved in the last appeal cycle, and then Rutherford Collegiate Prep in 2024. Now I'm going to pass it to Melanie to start diving into our staffing updates.
Thanks, Beth. So as we thought about how we scale, given our rapid expansion, our team, we really solicited feedback both from our operators, but we also talked with authorizers in other states where they serve as both the LEA and the authorizer to look at how they had scaled over time and what their staffing looked like when they have more schools. So particularly we had conversations with Colorado and with Nevada. There's not a ton of states out there that the statewide authorizer is also the LEA. So we wanted to make sure that we drew from their experience. So what we found is that we primarily been calling for our district functions. What other operators were doing that had a bigger portfolio is they tend to split out sort of finance and operations, and then what we classified as more like school programs and supports. So what we decided is that I will continue to lead sort of the finance and operations side of the work. And then we've brought on Nate Parker, who unfortunately could not be here with us today. He wanted to go on his honeymoon. I can't imagine why we decided to let him. So he is going to lead our school programs and supports teams. So I will continue to own finance-related matters, grant reimbursements, the data and student information system, as well as some of our general compliance, operational compliance items. And Nate is going to be really focused on building out federal programs and special populations teams, managing other academic initiatives, sort of the smattering of those things that come up from a district lens. And then also school safety will be a big area of focus for him. So we're really excited about that build out and being able to provide additional supports and technical assistance for our schools because we know that they need it, they want it, and that we want to make sure we can still offer it while we grow. So with that, we also hired some additional positions. We were funded, we were provided 3 additional positions from the General Assembly this year. And so we brought on 2 new staff members for the school programs teams. They'll be supporting federal programs and special populations. So I hope you all got to meet Claire here. And then Katie Bridges will also be joining us as our coordinator of special populations. We're also bringing on some additional staff to support district operations. We are bringing on a student data analyst. Very excited. She's been hired. She is starting August 7th. So she will be joining our team and helping Lawrence continue to support our schools in the student information system. And then I'm also still looking for a grants coordinator. So, you know, if you have anybody in your network, feel free to shoot them my way. So we're looking for a grants coordinator to also just help us continue to manage our growing volume of grants reimbursements and the additional grants management functions that are coming down the pipeline. The authorizing team has also added a data and accountability coordinator position to support their work. So they'll really be supporting the New Start appeals process and then also increasing their team's capacity for analyzing and reporting accountability data. That will allow the ops team to really be focused on keeping data clean in the student information system and our operational functions while adding some capacity to the authorizing team from an accountability lens as well. So that's it.
Hey, Melanie.
Yeah.
How many grants are you all managing? I'm just curious. So as you're talking, since this is being live streamed, in case somebody's listening that might be looking for a job.
How many like distinct grants are we
Yes.
managing? Where are we at, Gomer? About 15? Something like that? Yeah, 15-ish. So I think during our final set of reimbursements, I think Gomer processed about 57 individual claims to close out the year. So that's a lot. It's a lot. And it will just continue to grow as we add more schools.
Just by way of information, do we have any idea with our 13 schools of all the districts in the state? Are we in the top 10? Are we in the top? Do we know where we are as far as size of district?
Just size of district by number of schools, that
Yes.
I don't know, but we can find that out and get that to you.
Thank you.
We can absolutely get that. I would say we are rapidly growing into the top 10. I don't think we're quite there yet. I know, for example, like the Achievement School District, when it was at full scale, was absolutely in the top 10, and we are rapidly getting there. So we'll get a snapshot for you, but I think that's a really important context, and honestly, something when we go in front of the General Assembly and talk about our capacity and needs. We are a district and we're growing, and this is a really important for us to remain staffed from a capacity standpoint.
So something else that we, as we were thinking about scaling and getting ready to continue to grow, was we met and had a number of conversations around what we called sort of autonomy and scalability meetings. So we wanted to make sure that we were having a formal way to talk through feedback that we've gotten from our operators, review our own systems and processes, bring staff together to think through improvements for how we can make sure that we are maintaining a high accountability bar, but also looking at ways that we can streamline oversight and monitoring, both for our capacity's sake and also for our schools. So our goal is to try to ease administrative burden as much as possible, even though, there's a lot that people have to be compliant with, us and our schools included. But also wanted to make sure that we were being very intentional about how we're reviewing and thinking through our processes as we move forward. So we had covered the topics of assessments and accountability, site visits, quarterly monitoring, pre-opening processes, the reporting calendar, and then we also did some policy reviews and looked at our fiscal practices as well.
So from an authorizing standpoint, we definitely haven't been able to do some streamlining of processes, all the while also making sure that we maintain a high bar. Because not only are we holding our schools accountable for a high bar, but as an authorizer, we also are evaluated by state board through authorizer evaluations. We have to make sure that we are still running all our process to the highest of standards, all the while also giving our schools that increased autonomy when earned. We want to make sure that we are reducing administrative burden, but again, holding them accountable. And so one of the big changes that we are making going into the next school year is the length of the site visits. And so previously we spent an entire day at each of our school sites, and moving into the next school year, what we've determined is as long as the school, we're kind of using a three-pronged approach. So if the school is on track, if they are not in like an interim review year, a renewal year, or on probationary status, then we need to shorten their site visit to 2.5 days. So again, really giving them that earned autonomy. When we look at our quarterly monitoring process, this is something that we feel has been super beneficial for our schools, is we give them feedback on a quarterly basis, because we want to make sure that when the year comes to an end, that there's no surprises, that they know whether or not they're on track or off track. But it's very different doing quarterly monitoring for 4 schools or 9 schools versus 13, 16 and growing. So we are looking to adjust that process to still provide the regular feedback to our schools, but in a more efficient manner. And then just the last thing I would note is that for our pre-opening process, we've been really working to differentiate pre-opening for, say, a school that's already open, and within our portfolio, we already have a lot of their documents. We already know a lot about their systems and their personnel, and so we are giving them a little bit more condensed of a pre-opening process and really focusing those supports on those new start schools that need a lot of those often frequent touch points. And so that's really, for us, looking at the year ahead, what we're looking at as big outcomes of these conversations.
Yeah, and then when we were looking at our various LEA functions, we wanted to, again, think through how we could increase school autonomy, balance administrative burden, but also keep in mind our required monitoring from TDOE, the importance of licensure and background checks, IEP monitoring, subrecipient monitoring, the other things that we are, very much held accountable for, and our schools are held accountable for our LEA functions. So we updated several internal procedures, primarily just to streamline things and to incorporate operator feedback around the reporting calendar, around data management, around assessment, and around some of our financial reporting mechanisms. So one of the things, for example, that we've heard a lot from our operators is that our reporting calendar, we try to make it a comprehensive document that includes all of the compliance items that we know are coming up for the year. Obviously, there may be things that come up last minute or things that change, but we kind of went to our operators and said, hey, do y'all like this or is it too much? And they said, no, please put more in the reporting calendar. Make sure that we like having all of the information ahead of time so that we can plan our year accordingly and plan sort of our staff capacity. So we looked at how do we sort of tweak that, make sure that it's as effective as possible, but also modified some of our internal processes to make sure that sort of all team members are looped in and have a hand in that process, and that we're really being as comprehensive and efficient around that as possible. So one of the big updates that we are looking at implementing is around sort of our monitoring holistically for federal programs and fiscal requirements, as well as IEP monitoring. So for school year 23-24, what we're looking at moving towards is more of a risk-based assessment approach that drives our monitoring. So this would cover title programs, Individual with Disabilities Education Act, parent and family engagement requirements, and then fiscal requirements. And this would allow our schools the ability to earn some reduced monitoring if they have a track record of success, or we feel like they are low risk based on their experience level or some other factors that we've seen. So I will say we have a little bit of a pin in this right now because we are waiting for our monitoring designation from the Department of Education to sort of determine how exactly this year is going to run for us. We know that we anticipate that we will be up for on-site monitoring by the TDOE either this year or next year, one of the two. And so as we think about how we're going to implement this, what that transition will look like, we are going to have to sort of think through what our own district monitoring will look like for the year. It's a little bit of a different ballgame. We know that 4 or 5 of our schools will have on-site monitoring from the department to make sure that we prepared them and us effectively for that process. But that is something that I'm very excited about as an approach. It mirrors how we're monitored as a district. It mirrors a lot of the federal guidance and how they even approach their monitoring. And so I'm excited for this as a move forward for us as a team. I'm happy to take your questions.
One last question, I should know the answer to this. Do these schools or the operators have an internal audit process that they go through on their own?
So our schools have slightly varying audit. Every school that we have has an annual fiscal audit. Whether or not they have an internal audit procedure or what exactly that involves frequently depends on their size or their structure. So yes, all of our schools go through an internal audit. If they meet the single audit federal threshold, they get a single audit as well, which is I think all of them. But what their internal practices look like really is kind of dependent on that. But we do make sure that our monitoring, we're having very intentional feedback conversations with every school each year based on their monitoring results with us.
Okay, well, whether it's an internal report or an external report done by a third party, that's fine. Do you get access to those reports and review them as part of this process?
Yes, we get their annual audits. It's required that they submit to us. They're also publicly available on the comptroller's website, and then that actually uses those as the base of the financial performance framework, or the financial portion of the performance framework, and that is used to inform both that and then our own fiscal monitoring for other federal programs.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? All right, making progress. The last item on our agenda is a presentation on the charter school data landscape. Maggie Lund, you are recognized.
Thank you, Commissioner Richards. The previous educator in me feels like we need to stand and stretch or brain break, but I will continue
Continue on.
and push on. Thank you all for. Oh, we're fine. Okay.
We're fine.
I'm long-winded, but I'm not that long. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time and attention today. I'm really excited to stand before you and provide you all an overview of the charter school data landscape in Tennessee. We've collected and analyzed this data through the lens of better informing us about some of the common claims we hear circulating about charter schools. And so we'll be focusing primarily within this presentation on data that is from the 21-22 school year and data that is from the 2018-2019 school year. So both of those years provide pretty reliable data for us to analyze, as we didn't have any major interruptions like we did with 2020 data. But I do want to note that this data does not include data from this past school year, which is school year 22-23. That data is still under embargo. So we'll be providing you all an update on that data, particularly commission data, once that's publicly available, and we'll be at our next commission meeting. So as I kind of mentioned, we focused on 2 major themes when it comes to common claims of charter schools, which are who charter schools serve and the level with which they serve their students. So in this presentation, we'll further examine the students Tennessee charter schools are serving and the factors that we review to determine a successful charter school. So through our data analysis, first, the claim that charter schools in Tennessee serve more advantaged students is unfounded from our examination of the data, as charter schools tend to serve larger percentages of students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, which I'll demonstrate further once we get into the presentation with some deeper data in a second. But I also want to note that charter schools are more likely to serve students that are further academically behind in comparison to traditional public schools. Secondly, the claim that charter schools drastically underperform state averages academically is somewhat incomplete. It is true that overall averages statewide when looking at proficiency rates are higher than in charter schools. But when we're looking at context, we also want to compare to districts that have charter schools. And we also think it's important to break this down by subgroup and really look at how charter schools outperform proficiency rates of the state and the districts with charter schools when looking specifically at English language learners or limited English proficiency students and students with disabilities. Additionally, Tennessee charter schools have higher growth rates and TBOS composite scores than state averages in districts with charter schools. And I know we've had numerous conversations about this through our school performance framework of thinking about what determines a successful school. So not only just looking at proficiency, but also understanding the importance of growth as well. So let's take a look at the data and break this down in a little more detail. So here you have an overview of the sector. You can see the districts that have charter schools and the percent of students served in the districts along with the number of charter schools. I want to note a couple of things here as these numbers may look different from some of the things that you've seen before, and there's a reason for that. So the data in the schools served, so for instance in Memphis, those are only schools that are authorized by Memphis-Shelby County, and as you heard earlier in the panel presentation, there are numerous schools in Memphis that are authorized by the Achievement School District, and also the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission has Memphis schools as well. So I want to note that these, the number of these schools are the schools that are authorized by that direct district. It's also important to note that there are other authorizers, as I mentioned, such as the Commission and the ASD, that have schools within those districts, particularly in Nashville and Memphis. And you can see below that the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission, us. This is from school year 21-22 data where we show a number of 4 schools. We know that we have, this just demonstrates how drastically we have expanded over the last couple of years as we scaled to 9 last year and then further in future years.
Okay.
You can, yes.
I think it'd be great for this chart to also then, if I look at, let's say, Nashville, because I think it could be interpreted as misleading, that there's this many that are district, then there's this many that are ours. So I'd like to see a comprehensive, because again, knowing we've got some appeals coming up, I think it's going to be really important for us to be able to talk about number of charter schools total, because that's what we're going to, and not for somebody to say, well, wait a minute, they're, you know, what you're not aren't counting are the ones that you all have, something like this. So like for Memphis, it ought to be the ones that they have. It also ought to be ASDs. I don't mind if they're broken out, but I do think we need something. If we look at this, say, well, there are more than 19% of the students in Shelby County that are in some type of a charter school, just because we know the standard we're going to be held up to. We've already started seeing it again. And so I just would like, just if you could add here those categorical breakouts for us. They give us a comprehensive. Okay, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I think
Okay.
that's important to know. The nuance between authorizers is not always, it's
Yeah,
detailed. And so I
that's
think
correct.
making this simpler about geographic locations.
Thanks.
Absolutely. One more thing that I want to note here is that you can see here listed below that we have a note about the Achievement School District. And there are 19 schools here as of school year 21-22. Majority of ASD schools are in Memphis, and though some are also in Nashville, I just want to kind of ground us in and provide a reminder
The Achievement School District is a turnaround district, meaning
Right.
that schools to be in the ASD must qualify by being a priority school and scoring at the bottom 5% of all schools in the state of Tennessee. And so given the unique turnaround nature of these schools and to ensure a true apples to apples comparison across this data, we've chosen to exclude ASD data to ensure consistency as we're looking across the state charter school landscape. I just want to note that before we jump into these comparisons. So when looking at who attends charter schools, you can see here the percentage breakdown across all subgroups is listed. You'll see here that charter schools generally serve a higher population of the BHN subgroup, which is noted below as Black, Hispanic, and Native American, an economically disadvantaged subgroup than districts in which they are located. Charter school service of English language learners and students with disabilities are more mixed by district. And that was also evidenced earlier in Beth's presentation that she provided for you all as well. So in the 2023 Credo report that came out from Stanford University that was recently released, national data across the charter sector was examined. And this report found that nationally, the claim that charter schools serve a more advantaged population of students was unsubstantiated. And it also looked by state in this report, and when looking at Tennessee data specifically, the claim also was held. So this essentially means that students from the bottom and middle deciles of achievement are more represented in charter schools than in other feeder schools. So this chart also shows that students from the top decile of achievement are actually negatively represented in charter schools. So ultimately, this is demonstrating that charter schools in Tennessee serve a traditionally disadvantaged and lower performing group of students, making the claim that charter schools are serving more advantaged students unfounded. So we're going to pivot a little bit, and we're going to talk about success rate. So there have been substantiated claims that charter schools underperform state averages when it comes to success rate, and it's important to ensure that we properly define what success rate is. So success rate is overall proficiency in TCAP. So success rates represent the total number of valid TCAP tests with a performance level of met expectations and exceeded expectations divided by the total number of valid TCAP tests. So what that basically is showing us is a rate of success. So who are the students that met or exceeded the expectations? Success rates are used in the Tennessee Accountability Model frequently. They're used in the 1 and 3 year intervals to aid in determining district and school accountability designations, such as priority school designations. And the commission also functionally uses success rate as well within our school performance framework. So when we're looking at academic proficiency, we use success rate to determine the percent of students that are achieving, which are meeting and exceeding expectations for each subject, which, as we have defined before, is English or ELA, math, science, and social studies. Also, we use success rate when looking at academic proficiency by subgroup, which we break down with ELA and math in the 4 major subgroups that I've had listed on previous slides, which is the BHN subgroup, economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, and English language learners. And then finally, I want to note here that success rate is calculated for the resident district for comparison purposes on our school performance framework. So those kind of achievement metrics in our academic performance framework are essentially utilizing success rate.
This is charter commission school.
So in thinking about success rate, it's important to note, again, that success rate measures solely achievement on TCAP. This does not include any growth measures, which we know are also important when we're looking at charter school performance. When looking solely at statewide averages for success rate, those averages are higher than both charter schools and districts with charter schools, which you'll see in some charts in a second. But when we break success rate down by subgroup, since school year 18-19, EL students have consistently performed higher in charter schools than in the geographic district of residence. And in some cases, charter schools' EL proficiency rates outperform state averages. And the same situation applies for students with disabilities. So the key, yes.
On this slide, would it be clear if we, on the blue box, if I'm reading it right, charter commission schools,
These are all charter schools in the state of Tennessee.
the blue is. So
And they
what's the
have
difference
ASC
between the
review.
blue and the gray?
So here, what we're seeing here is in the blue bar
Mm-hmm.
is all charter schools. So that would be any school that is considered a charter school in the state of Tennessee minus schools that are AST schools. As we mentioned before, we've excluded that data across the board. What we see in the gray bar are districts with charter schools. So for instance, if we're looking at schools across the state of Memphis, Shelby County, that gray bar is the data for districts that have charter schools within
I get
them.
it.
So those would be the data for Memphis, Shelby County and Metro Nashville Public Schools. And then the orange bar here is the state average across the
Right.
entire state of public schools.
Well, again, we know, thank you for the explanation, but we know, unfortunately, we don't get to have you stand up and give the explanation when somebody takes this and says, this is just number. It would be great if you could somehow capsule what you just said so that it isn't interpreted that we've done something with the data trying to make it look better. Or you know what I'm saying? But what
Yes.
you just said,
I can summarize
that
it.
helped me.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just think that's a good line to have
Sure.
when somebody looks at it.
Absolutely. So the chart that you're looking at right here is comparing English language arts, and we're looking solely at success rate. So as I mentioned, this is comparing charter schools to districts with charter schools and to the state averages here. And then here we also have math included within your presentation. You can see here the outline of charter schools with the state average and districts with charter schools. So to just stamp this, you know, the claim that charter schools underperform state averages is substantiated by this data when just looking at the main subjects. However, it's also important to look by subgroup, and so we've broken this data down by subgroup as well. So you can see here when looking at English learners, charter schools in some cases are actually outperforming state averages and are outperforming the districts with charter schools as well. The same goes for students with disabilities, in some cases even more. Charter schools are outperforming consistently state averages and districts with charter schools averages. So when looking at the economically disadvantaged subgroup, you can see here that it's a little more mixed, that charter schools are generally outperforming districts with charter schools average, but is somewhat more mixed with the state average. And then here we have the BHN subgroup. The data is displayed here. So you can see the charter schools state averages and districts with charter schools average. So as I've mentioned kind of throughout this presentation, when we're talking about proficiency, I think it's also really important to look at growth. And we know that it's particularly within our school performance framework, achievement is not the only measure that we use to review charter school performance, and that we use multiple measures. Student growth is a very important measure, one that is represented within our school performance framework. And so when looking at student growth, charter school students are outpacing their peers at traditional public schools when it comes to growth. So in the same 2023 Credo report that I mentioned earlier, to measure student growth, the study outlines this through a lens of students earning the equivalent of additional days of instruction. So this report outlines that Tennessee charter school students receive the equivalent of 33.5 additional learning days than a typical public school in reading, and 38.7 in math. This growth was also sustained within this report since 2013. It's also important to note that we also look at TBOS when measuring growth. And charter schools outpace traditional public schools in growth rates, which I'll better display on the next slide here, where you can see the TBOS composite comparison here. And so we've broken this down in a similar fashion where we've looked at charter schools, districts with charter schools, and states. And so here you can see that the number or the percentage of students that significantly exceed expectations, and meet expectations which is a TBOS 3, 4, or 5, are much higher in charter schools than districts with charter schools in the state overall. So for next steps, we will be providing an update for you all regarding school year 22-23 data once it's unembargoed and available for your review. And ideally, that'll be during our October meeting. This data will include student outcomes, which is the letter grade calculation, success rates, comparative data to the resident district, TBOS, and mission-specific goal outcomes for our schools. And I also want to note that we've already begun reviewing this data with our schools in their year-end closeout meetings that have been happening this and next week. So we've begun those discussions regarding how this year is starting to close out with our schools.
Are there any questions for Melanie? Okay, I would just encourage you, if you can get that data for the October meeting, I think it'd be critically important. I think we need to have it for discussions with the legislature as we move into the regular session. I think there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding, and we probably need to be figuring out what's the best way to publicize this and get some of this information out so that we're not working with a world that nobody wants to talk about the facts. But thank you so much for your help, for your doing this. I mean, I think this information is critical to our collective success, and we are committed to providing quality seats in charter schools that provide a positive alternative to children in districts throughout the state. So we can't manage what you don't measure. So thank you for measuring.
Madam Chair. Can
Yes,
you
sir.
get it to a one-pager, you think? I know you will, because that way, I mean, a lot in here, but really trying to get that boiled down, because I'd love for them to come back and say, show me more, versus us giving them a real executive summary, because this is good data to really understand, but it helps us get them focused, and love to have it when we get ready to do our new appeals in October, so we can come back and put it out there then, that allows us to talk about the real data as it applies to charter schools, rather than we know sort of what gets made up.
Commissioner Carter?
I truly don't want to get ahead of our skis here, but this is good news. And I do think that, and I echo, Madam Chair, your comments, this word needs to spread. It's not only to legislators, it's to the general public.
Yeah.
And you have to sometimes hear things 6 and 7 times before them to resonate and sink in. So the issue of marketing campaign, I don't know if it's feasible. I don't know if it's possible. There's some political challenges, I think, to that. And again, we don't want to get ahead of our skis, but the public needs to be aware of this. And we can't just tell it once. You can't have just one, op-ed piece.
Mhm.
We need to do this, and maybe even to the degree there's some marketing dollars that need to be spent. Thank you.
You. And I just want to reiterate too, I think we're really looking forward to having our school year 22-23 data in hand, because I think that'll further build this out and tell that story. And so we're somewhat limited with what we can do now, because we're really looking back almost 2 years at this point. So once we have that data, we'll make sure to update this, even further from there.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for your attendance and participation at this meeting of the School Performance and Accountability Committee of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. At this time, I'd like to ask, is there any final comments? Okay, hearing none, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The ayes have it. The next meeting of the School Performance and Accountability Committee is scheduled for September 21, 2023, and we are